Hello, everyone. We have a special guest today, Drachinifel,
Hello.
the naval expert. If you're not subscribed to his channel already, you should do it right now. And we will cover something more, well, particular. It's about what the British and especially the Royal Navy thought about the Regia Marina or the Italians before and during the war, because in general, there is a quite negative view on Italy in the Second World War. And one issue is, I think it's mostly focused on the land side and on land warfare. And the question is if there's a serious change if we look at the naval side, which gets often more or less forgotten because also naval warfare is quite different because you have it's more strategic and less it takes decades to build a fleet, and it takes only, under quotation marks, years to build an army. So basically, let's start with what did the British leadership and other notables think about the Italians?
So, pre-war, generally, a lot of it was actually, ironically enough, that the Royal Navy didn't think about the Italians all that much. The Washington Naval Treaty and the subsequent London Naval Treaty, as you can see, the Royal Navy is much, much more worried about the US Navy and the Japanese Navy, and possibly with an eye to making sure the German Navy stays at the size that they've restricted it to by the Treaty of Versailles. And so when the Royal Navy commences its 1930s building program, top tier in its mind, now that the tensions with the Americans have died off somewhat, top tier is we're probably going to end up at war in the Middle East. In the Far East, with Japan. So that's how they build their fleet. The Mediterranean, it has a large fleet still, but the Mediterranean fleet is not particularly seen as a counter to the Italians. It's seen as a kind of central reserve, because it means that if something goes wrong, the Mediterranean fleet is ideally placed to respond, because they can go via the Suez Canal into the Indian and then the Pacific, or via the Gibraltar Straits, both of which are under British control, out into the Atlantic. They're really thinking in terms, for the Italian Navy, in terms of the French dealing with them if they have to be dealt with at all, because France and Italy have their own little subsection of most of the naval treaties where effectively they're granted parity. And for the majority of the interwar period, the British are looking at it and thinking, well, the French don't particularly want to spend a lot of money on their navy, and the Italians don't seem to want to spend a lot of money on their navies. And the French and the Italians have this kind of unspoken agreement whereby neither one of them will particularly start any massive capital ship construction, and therefore both of them can save money. So that dictates most of the 1920s and early 1930s, and the competition between France and Italy is mostly restricted to cruisers and destroyers and such like. But in terms of numerical fleets, so how many ships they have, it's kind of a tertiary concern for the British. Now that starts to change as you get into the early to mid 1930s with the rise of fascist Italy, because then all of a sudden, obviously alongside the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, now the focus is becoming less and less we might end up having to fight Japan, and more we might end up having to fight another war in Europe. And so you get this various policies of appeasement to try and stave that off. But part of that calculation does become we now have to think about who we might have to fight in Europe. But it's very much a 1930s, mid-1930s kind of calculation. And to a degree, even in as far as the late 1930s, they're still not thinking purely in terms of a fight in European waters only. For example, HMS Vanguard is put together as kind of a quick build battleship. But the reasoning that the Admiralty gives is that we might end up having to fight Japan and Germany and or Italy at the same time. Therefore, we need significant numerical advantage in battleships so we can face off against both of them. So Japan's still very much on the Royal Navy's mind. America, obviously, during the 1930s, prospect of war with them is decreasing a lot. Towards the end of the 1930s, they're thinking about maybe having to fight against Germany and Italy, one or the other, because there's the sort of whole flare-ups. You get things like Ethiopia and such, where Italy's not really pleasing anyone with their actions there. But because the Italian fleet is still, up until the very almost the very last minute, limited by treaty to a size that's significantly below the Royal Navy, they're still thinking of the Italian Navy in terms of, well, the French will deal with it. And we see that a lot in the immediate dispositions of ships going into World War II, where the French, although it's not quite the same level of split as you see in World War I, the French are still primarily the ones who are looking after the Western Mediterranean theatre, which includes the Italians. With the British, they've still got the Mediterranean fleet there, but a lot of it is still based over in Alexandria, looking more towards potentially having to go and sort out something with Japan than anything else. Now, that's not to say that the Royal Navy completely discounted the Italians entirely. They did keep a close eye on them, especially when they started rebuilding and modernising their old World War I era battleships, the Conte de Cavour and Andrea Doria class. But it was almost more of a technical exercise because the Royal Navy was also obviously modernising the Queen Elizabeths, so they wanted to see how that would be done in Italy. And when it came to the main focus of the Royal Navy, which was protecting trade, they were a lot more interested in what the Italians were doing with their cruisers. And part of that sort of escalation of focusing on the Italian Navy as a potential threat in the mid to late 30s, part of that is informed by the examination of one of the Italian cruisers that managed to get damaged and ended up dry docked in a port where the British could observe it, and they suddenly figured, hang on a minute, this is no way, shape or form a treaty cruiser. This is several thousand tons above a treaty displacement limit. They must be planning something.
In that regard, I often read about the Mediterranean being the artery of Great Britain or the British Empire. So it was also focused on this, looking at protecting the trade lines mostly.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the British trade network, effectively, although there obviously is some trade with Africa and such, like the two main arteries of trade that the British have are the Atlantic in general. You've got trade with Canada, America, South America, etc. So it's diffuse but tightens up closer to British waters. But then, as you say, you do have the Mediterranean, and with the Suez Canal, that allows all the trade with India, the Far East, Australia, New Zealand, etc. All of that trade, as well as especially in the 1930s, as the Persian oil fields start to come up to speed, the oil trade as well is all coming through the Mediterranean. So it is a key lifeline for the Royal Navy. They need to keep the Mediterranean open. They need to keep Gibraltar and Suez under their control. Their thinking at the time is more the case of, it's a very obvious weakness that we need to secure, but it's not one that they are assessing as being directly threatened by the people who have navies within there for most of the interwar period. Although, as I say, that towards the end of the 1930s, that does start to change somewhat in their calculations.
So basically, they have the French Navy there to cover the Western Mediterranean, and this probably also explains a bit more the attack of the Royal Navy against the French Navy after the armistice with Germany, because, well, if they are not on our side, we must make sure that they don't fall.
Yes, exactly that. And you can also see from the way the Royal Navy is deployed, if they were thinking very seriously and long term about having to face off against the Italian Navy, you'd expect them to be reinforcing and upgrading the facilities at the Grand Harbour in Valletta in Malta, because that is almost directly opposite the Italian peninsula. That's where you'd want to base a battle fleet if you're going to get into a straight up shooting match with the Italians straight off. But in fact, they don't do that. Although the Grand Harbour is a very nice base for the Royal Navy in peacetime, and they do have extensive dockyard facilities and such there, it's not a kind of a wartime heavily fortified base as such. And when you look at the deployments, even for the first couple of years of the war, when the Italians are still mostly neutral, the deployments of the Royal Navy are out in Alexandria at the Suez Canal and out at Gibraltar with Force H. So they're still at that point focusing very much on guarding the entrances to keep other hostiles out of the Mediterranean rather than thinking about hostiles potentially being inside the Mediterranean. Although, as we said, the French are supposed to deal with anything that happens there. And as you mentioned, if one of the concerns was that if they do end up at war with Italy, which by the time of the armistice with France they were, because the Italians got in on that particular conflict just before the French completely collapsed, when you look at where Mers El Kabir is, it puts the Force H at Gibraltar in a rather nasty position of having potentially enemy forces on both sides. In a sort of potted history covers the pre-war thinking, in as much as I say, and up until almost the last minute, the Italian Navy was probably fourth or fifth on the list of things the Royal Navy was worried about having to fight.
So, and this basically probably changes once the French drop out of the war. Then it gets, then the priority of the Italian Navy rises.
It's almost a worst case scenario for Britain because, as we said, they were relying on the French to provide a lot of the support to deal with the Italians if they got hostile, and you had this almost 1-2 punch of the French dropping out and the Italians joining on the Axis side pretty much simultaneously. At least as far as a strategic concern is as a strategic outlook is concerned. If you, obviously tactically speaking, there's a bit of an overlap. But they'd been eyeing them up a little bit with a little bit more hesitancy, because obviously the Italians had started laying down the Littorio class. The French had corresponded with the Richelieus, but whereas the Royal Navy was pretty confident that anything they sent into the Mediterranean within their existing stock could handle the Italian World War I dreadnoughts, even in their rebuilt state. Once you start talking about something like the Littorios, then you have to start taking a serious look at what you've actually got that you can use to face off against them. You can't just rely on, say, the old R class and hope that they'll do all right against Littorio or Vittorio Veneto or something like that. And once the Italians are properly in the war, then all of a sudden everything changes, because now you've got trade is under threat. You've lost the French fleet, so you're going to have to deal with this entirely on your own. And in many ways, it's the Royal Navy's worst nightmare, because they've now got to deal with the Kriegsmarine in the North Sea and the Atlantic. They've got to deal with the Regia Marina in the Mediterranean. And although at the immediate outbreak of the conflict with Italy, it's not a factor, but shortly thereafter, they'd also obviously end up having to deal with the Japanese in the Far East. And so that they'd planned to be able, initially they'd hoped to fight any one of them. They'd made plans to fight any two, but now they're having to fight all three, and without the ally that they thought they would be able to count on. With the loss of France. So all of a sudden it becomes a much, much bigger problem for them. And doubly so because you still have oil and other trade coming in from the Far East that Britain needs, and it's going to be very costly to redirect all of that around the entire continent of Africa. You've also got Malta, which needs to be held, which is now right in Italy's sights and miles away from any major British naval base. And of course, you have all the Italian-held territories in North Africa, which on the land side threaten the British holdings. And the Italian fleet obviously would need to supply and task the land forces. And you've also got a secondary concern, which is that, as I'm sure you know, the fighting in the North African desert, if there is going to be any, the further you get into the desert, the less and less hospitable it becomes. And so most of your traffic, transport, and offensive routes are going to be very much bound to the coast. And when anything's bound to the coast, that means the ability of an enemy navy or your own navy to interfere with the operations of the other side is very much increased, as opposed to, say, World War I, where the trenches go most of the way along the German-French border, and the Royal Navy can only effect change off of the coast in any potential conflict that they're now looking at in North Africa. The bulk of certainly the logistics and a lot of the offensive capacity is actually well within range of either naval shore bombardment or other interference from the sea.
Do you have what the Royal Navy thought in terms of how the quality or the quantity of the Regia Marina? Was there anything?
The quality, the Royal Navy was relatively impressed with the Italian Navy as a fighting force, at least on paper. They knew from some incidents where they'd observed the Italians sort of quote unquote in action. And bear in mind, we had the Spanish Civil War where you had pretty much everybody with a ship was floating off the Spanish coast at some point or another doing neutrality patrols. So it was a great opportunity for all sides to carefully eye up each other's vessels and how they performed in action. So they had an idea that the Italian Navy was a fairly competent naval force. They didn't massively overrate them, but they certainly weren't going to underestimate them either. They viewed them as basically a professional naval fighting force. Quantity-wise was where the Royal Navy was much more worried, because although the Kriegsmarine was much closer to Britain, the simple fact of the matter was that the Italians went into the war and pretty much for most of the war stayed as a much larger navy than the Kriegsmarine when it came to pretty much anything other than submarines. And so that was a very big focus for the Royal Navy, because all of a sudden you're faced with a large battle fleet that perhaps the entire Royal Navy didn't have to worry about. But when you, as we said, we have to split your forces 2 ways, and then with the entry of Japan 3 ways, all of a sudden the Royal Navy is faced with actually having to face off against an Italian fleet that either matches or outnumbers it a lot of the time, and has the additional advantage of being relatively centrally located, whereas the Royal Navy forces are split either side of them.
And once the firing started, was there a certain change in attitude towards the Italian Navy?
Yes, there were multiple changes in opinion. It depended on exactly which part of the Italian Navy they were dealing with. Very quickly, they learned that they didn't particularly rate the Italian naval strike aircraft, albeit that some of them were from the Italian Air Force as well, but they didn't rate them particularly highly. Although obviously much is made of the state of the Royal Navy's carrier aviation at the start of the war, the fact was that Fulmars and such like were viewed as perfectly capable of dealing with the Italian aircraft that were showing up. A lot of the accounts from that early part of the period, the logbook is very calm about things like, oh, right, Italian sort of spotter plane seen, Fulmar launched, Italian spotter plane shot down, rinse and repeat for several days. So until the arrival of Fliegerkorps 10 and the distribution of a number of German aircraft, including lots of Stukas, to the Italians, until that point, the Italian air assault on the Navy, whether that be from Regia Marina assigned aircraft or the Italian Air Force itself, wasn't seen particularly highly. The battleships were a major concern to start with, and they certainly respected the Littorios for their size and firepower. However, after the first few encounters, once Admiral Iachino kind of started to adopt this, after Matapan adopted this policy of almost running at every sign of a Royal Navy shadow, the estimation of the quality of the Italian battleships' leadership went down quite significantly. There's a certain amount of Royal Navy boldness to that as well. I mean, when you look at the engagement where Warspite hits Giulio Cesare at ridiculous range, Warspite is pretty much forging ahead almost alone. Everyone else who's with it is trailing. So Warspite's technically outnumbered, but they score a hit. And they're quite surprised when, although it looks like Giulio Cesare has been hit relatively badly because of the location of it, the Italians just turn away. And again, in a couple of the accounts from people who were aboard Warspite at the time, they basically finish up their account with, well, it looks like the Italians had had enough and went off, which to the Royal Navy's policy of attack seemed to be very counterintuitive. And so they ended up not particularly rating the battleships. Their aggression wasn't rated very highly. They were still considered a threat in and of themselves, and something that had to be dealt with. But yeah, you can see later on when sort of Vittorio Veneto shows up almost on its own, the response of the Royal Navy in one of the other battles where there's just cruisers present, and not even heavy cruisers there, but various collection of light cruisers. Their response isn't run away. Their response is lay smoke and weave through the fire and hope it gets close enough for us to take some pot shots at. Now, fair enough, they do have a convoy to protect, but even so, that's not the kind of tactics you would expect to see a Royal Navy light cruiser unit taking if they were, say, facing off against Tirpitz or Bismarck, for that matter, and even against Scharnhorst, which is significantly less well armed than Vittorio Veneto is. When you look at the Battle of the North Cape, there's a lot more concern in the logs and the readings of Belfast, Sheffield, and Norfolk when they go up against Scharnhorst than there seems to be in the logs of the light cruisers that are facing off against Vittorio Veneto, with the exception of the thought that, well, if we get hit by a 15-inch shell, we're probably dead. But when you work your way down further into the smaller craft, there's a lot more respect going on there for their combat capabilities. Obviously, we have the Italian chariots, the human, the British call them chariots, but the Italian human torpedoes, they call them the I think it's mile or something. I think it means pigs. But the skills of the Italian frogmen are definitely very well respected once the British figure out the Italians even have them, because for quite a while they're not sure. And for example, at Gibraltar, they don't know that they're actually there. They kind of can't quite figure out why merchant shipping keeps exploding for no reason. But then you've got submarine. The submarine arm is definitely viewed as a threat. It's not quite considered as threatening as the U-boats, but in large part that's because the U-boats are obviously the boot that's standing on Britain's throat, whereas the Italian submarines, outside of a few that go out to operate in the Atlantic, are largely a tactical rather than a strategic concern when you're looking at something on the scale of the Battle of the Atlantic. The destroyers and cruisers of the Italian Navy, the destroyers and their heavy cruisers are viewed with a great deal of respect. The light cruisers, not so much. The light cruisers, unfortunately, suffer from a tendency to, on the Italian side, to be small, high speed, and not particularly well protected. So they do end up running away from things that are relatively small in the Royal Navy's estimation, such as HMAS Sydney, for example, during its stint in the Mediterranean. Because they keep running away, they start to think of the Italian light cruisers as not a particularly massive threat to warships, although they do know that by dint of that same sort of high speed environment, they are a big threat to convoys. But the Italian destroyers are definitely seen as able combatants, and there's a lot of very fierce actions with Italian destroyers against surrounding various convoys and sweeps in the central and eastern Mediterranean that earns them a fair bit of kudos from their Royal Navy counterparts. The heavy cruisers are seen more often in fleet actions and the bigger assaults against the convoys, but they're still rated as fairly serious threats because they are willing to come out and fight. They're pretty accurate when they start shooting, and they know from pre-war assessments, such as the cruiser that ended up in the dry dock where it got measured, that these ships are big, powerful combatants, and the Italian captains certainly seem able and willing to get stuck in with them, which is one of the reasons, amongst many, that something like the Battle of Cape Matapan is seen as and trumpeted as such a victory. I mean, apart from the fact it is a crushing victory, the fact is, overnight, the Royal Navy managed to remove 3 major Italian heavy cruisers from the playing field, which for them was an excellent result.
In terms of that the battleships were far less aggressive and less respected, was this due to the Italian captains or the leadership like holding them back, like because they're too expensive, or what is the reasoning for this, that the smaller vessels are way more aggressive?
It seems to be the nature of almost every navy that when talking about ships on the scale of destroyers, they seem to select the captains of those ships for aggression anyway. And they are smaller, they're more numerous, and so it's generally held in most navies that you can, especially in World War II, that you can afford, you don't want to lose them, but you can afford to put them in riskier situations. And you combine that, therefore, so more numerous deployments, riskier situations, and captains that have been picked more for aggression, that then you suddenly end up with a lot of very sharp, fierce fighting, which engenders respect on both sides. When it came to the battleships, as I said, the technical capability of the battleships, especially the Littorios, is very much respected. But the aggression just isn't there. Early on, it definitely is. But once you get past that initial phase and the Royal Navy starts to strengthen its own presence, and you get, after Matapan, as I said, with the Italian leadership not wanting to risk them because they're seeing Matapan-style ambushes around every corner, then the opinion of the Italian Admiralty and their ability to conduct a large-scale fleet action goes down quite significantly. The respect for the individual captains is still there on a ship-by-ship basis. They're sort of when they're observing the actions of the Italian capital ships, which quite often are operating on their own or in pairs during most of the war. Again, from some of the accounts of the Royal Navy officers who fought them, they describe how these battleships would come charging over the horizon very aggressively, even if they did then try and fight it out at long range. Sort of down-rating ships based on their captain's conduct was more on a case-by-case basis. So, as we said, for example, with Giulio Cesare, the idea that the ship would take one hit and then turn away from action when it actually technically had an advantage with the rest of its friends showing up quicker than Warspites could, that would have earned that particular ship something of a sort of a down-voted reputation, if you like, amongst the Royal Navy. But I think a lot of the general opinion from what I've read of various veterans' accounts seems to be that they respected the individual Italian ships and their captains unless and until they demonstrated something that they saw as not particularly aggressive, like turning tail and running. But they definitely didn't rate the Italian leadership very well much after the first, say, 6 to 8 months of the war.
Okay, there seems to be a common thread here.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, that's not to say that the Royal Navy was perfectly aware of the fairly substantial threat that the Italians posed. They lost a lot of ships, and it becomes, I think, it becomes a bit difficult when you're trying to pin down exactly how many ships the Royal Navy lost in the Mediterranean. The numbers are there. We can tell the numbers quite easily, but some of them are at the hands of the Italians, some of them are at the hands of the Germans, some of them are at the hands of Italians flying German equipment like the Stuka, and others. I mean, in theory, you could even say all losses in the Mediterranean in some way are attributable to the Italians, because if they hadn't entered the war on the German side, then the Germans wouldn't be there, most likely, and certainly not in the numbers that they were historically, at which point, if a ship gets sunk by a mass Stuka attack by Fliegerkorps 10, is that purely a loss to the Germans, or is that a loss caused by the Germans but overall caused by a situation that has been generated by the Italians being involved in the conflict at all?
Yeah, that's quite a difficult point. But I think we wrap up this episode, and in the upcoming episode, we'll speak more about the contributions of the Italian Navy during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And so, big thank you here, Drachinifel.
Thank you very much.
And be sure to check out his channel. There's some videos linked up in the cards if you want to check them out, and also in the comments. So thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.
Bye.